Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Take a breath, settle in, get comfortable. Before we can talk about death, before we can talk about the specific, horrible, galaxy-shaking kind of death that is at the center of everything we're exploring today, we need to go somewhere first. We need to go somewhere that most people, most sane people, most people who value their continued existence try very hard to never think about at all. Or we need to step into a place that the scholars and missionaries and terrified survivors of the 41st millennium speak of in hushed voices, with real dread layered beneath the careful clinical language. We need to go to the warp. Now, I know we've touched on the warp before on this channel. I know that many of you have a sense of what it is and why it matters. But today's topic demands that we spend some real, unhurried time there, because everything that follows, every consequence, every horror, every quiet tragedy we're going to trace through the lore grows directly out of what the warp actually is at its most fundamental level. If you don't feel the warp in your chest, the way the crew of an Imperial vessel feels it pressing against the hull, then the story of the Navigator's death won't land the way it deserves to. So, imagine that somewhere behind reality, behind every single thing you can see and touch and measure and understand, there is another dimension entirely. Or not another universe in the comfortable science fiction sense, where everything is the same except the technology is slightly different, or history went a different way. Something far stranger. Something that doesn't obey the rules you were raised to believe were fundamental to the nature of existence. A dimension that is composed entirely of psychic energy, as the raw accumulated overflow of consciousness and emotion and thought and feeling from every sentient being that has ever existed in the Milky Way galaxy. Your joy, your grief, your petty irritations, and your petty pleasures, and the small private terrors you carry with you and never tell anyone about. The collective rage of 10 billion soldiers going to war. The collective grief of a hive world that has just been bombarded from orbit. Yet the ecstasy and the suffering and the hope and the despair, all of it bleeds through the thin barrier between the universe you live in and that other place. It doesn't vanish when you stop feeling it. It doesn't dissipate into nothing the way heat eventually disperses into the surrounding atmosphere. It collects there, in the warp, in a churning, howling, impossible ocean of psychic force that has been building since the first moment any thinking creature looked at the stars and felt afraid. That is the Imperium, the Empyrean, the Sea of Souls, an understanding that it is made of this, made of feeling, literally constructed from the emotional output of consciousness, is what explains why it behaves the way it does. The warp is not a passive storage medium for psychic energy. It is reactive, in the same way that an ocean is reactive to the weather, and the tides and the boats crossing it, and the things living within it. When enormous quantities of specific kinds of emotion are generated in the material universe, they create specific shapes and currents and storms in the warp. Extended periods of great warfare, and there have been 10,000 years of near-constant warfare in the 41st millennium, create vast zones of turbulence in the corresponding regions of the warp. The birth of particularly powerful psychic consciousnesses can create ripples that propagate across the immaterium for years. And the psychic energy that has been accumulating for hundreds of millions of years has not remained inert, formless. It has congealed. It has crystallized. It has, in the most literal sense available to us, come alive. The four great chaos gods, Horn, the blood god, collector of rage and martial fury, Nurgle, the plague father, collector of disease and despair, and the strange comfort of acceptance, Tzeentch, the changer of ways, collector of hope and ambition, and the desire for change, Slanesh, the dark prince, collector of excess and sensation, and the hunger for perfection, are not external to the warp. They were not imported into it from somewhere else. They are the warp, in certain aspects and concentrations. They are what happens when billions of years of mortal emotional output in specific registers, the rage of warfare, the suffering of plague, the plotting of ambition, the excess of sensation, accumulates into enough critical mass to generate will. to generate intent, to generate an entity that is not merely an accumulation of feeling, but a being that can feel, that can desire, that can act. It is worth pausing here before we move on, because this is one of the most counterintuitive ideas in all of 40k's cosmology, and it deserves a moment of genuine attention. The Chaos Gods are not evil in the way that a villain in a conventional story is evil. They did not choose their nature. They did not arrive at cruelty through some moral failure or deliberate decision to embrace darkness. They are what mortal emotion, accumulated across geological timescales, becomes when left to its own devices in a dimension without the regulating framework of physical reality. Khorne is not angry. Khorne is anger, crystallized and made self-aware. Nurgle does not feel despair. Nurgle is what despair becomes when it is immense enough and old enough to generate consciousness, when they are mirrors of the mortal experience, scaled to incomprehensible size and freed from the constraints that make mortal emotion bearable because it is finite. The horror of the Chaos Gods is not that they are other. It is that they are made of us. The moment we understand this, we understand why the warp is so extraordinarily dangerous for anything with a soul. Because for these entities, for the smaller demons and warp creatures that constitute the broader ecology of the Imperium, yet the soul of a mortal being is not merely a navigational hazard or an environmental consideration. It is food. It is fuel. It is the very substance from which their existence is woven. A human soul in the warp is a light in perfect darkness, visible across enormous distances, and every predator in that darkness is oriented toward it. This is the environment that Imperial ships transit through every day. Every routine cargo run, every troop deployment, every pilgrim vessel crossing between shrine worlds, every courier carrying strategic dispatches between naval command posts, all of them enter the warp, and all of them, at the moment of entry, become immediately and intensely visible to everything in the Imperium. The ship's hull is a physical barrier. The Geller field, and we will discuss that technology in detail, provides a metaphysical one. But the souls inside the ship glow, they shine, and the darkness presses back. What makes this sustainable at all, what makes warp travel possible despite all of this, is a combination of three things: the warp drive that moves the ship, the Geller field that protects it, and the navigator who guides it. Remove any one of these three things, and the journey becomes extraordinarily dangerous. Remove two of them, and the journey becomes a matter of how long until the disaster rather than whether there will be one. But we are going to focus on what happens when the third element, the navigator, is removed. Specifically, removed in the most final way possible. Removed in the middle of a transit, when the ship is already committed to the warp, when there is no easy real space alternative within reach, when the darkness is pressing in from all sides, and the only thing keeping the crew on a course toward home was a very particular kind of human being sitting in a sanctum and doing something that no machine in the Imperium's arsenal can replicate. Before we get to the death, though, we need to understand the life. We need to understand what a navigator actually is and what they are actually doing when they guide a ship through the warp. Because only then does the absence of them carry its proper weight. The galaxy, in the quiet around us, is vast. The distances between its stars are incomprehensible in terms of human experience. The nearest star to our own sun sits over 4 light years away, a distance that, even traveling at the speed of light, would take over 4 years to cross. The inhabited systems of the Imperium spread across a galaxy that spans over 100,000 light years, and are separated from each other by distances that make 4 light years seem trivial. An empire of this scale, connected only by ships traveling at light speed or below, would not be an empire in any meaningful sense. Communication and coordination across thousands of light years would take thousands of years. Armies could not be deployed to respond to threats. Supplies could not flow between specialized worlds. The civilization would fragment at its first crisis, each system retreating into isolated self-sufficiency. The warp solves this problem, or rather, the warp is the reason the problem is soluble. Ships that enter the Imperium can cover distances in weeks or months that would take decades or centuries of real space travel at the fastest velocities physical vessels can achieve. The warp does not observe the same relationship between space and time that real space does. Yet movement through the warp corresponds to movement in real space in ways that are complex and non-linear, but the general principle holds. You can get from here to very far away in a fraction of the time it would take to do the same journey in normal space. This is what makes the Imperium of Man possible. This is what makes a political and cultural entity spanning over 1 million worlds a coherent concept rather than an absurdity. As the warp is both the greatest gift and the greatest danger the galaxy has ever provided to humanity. Every single time an Imperial ship enters the warp, it is threading a needle between salvation and absolute catastrophe, and the person holding the thread is the Navigator. Section 2. Born Different, the Navigator. The formal scientific designation is Homo navigo, a subspecies of humanity, thus classified as distinct from baseline humans in the same way that baseline humans are classified as distinct from their genetic forebears, sharing the overwhelming majority of biological architecture, but carrying a single, critical, world-changing genetic modification. The Navigator gene. Its origins are documented with the degree of certainty the dark age of technology generally affords, which is to say, somewhat certain, substantially mythologized, and open to occasional contradiction. On what is broadly accepted across Imperial scholarship is that Navigator-type mutations began appearing in humanity approximately during the 22nd millennium of the old calendar, deep in the age of technology, when humanity was first learning to deliberately engineer the genetics of specific individuals to fulfill specific roles. Whether the Navigator gene was a deliberate product of this engineering, or a happy accident of natural mutation that was then cultivated and stabilized through selective breeding, or something else entirely involving factors that Imperial scholars would prefer not to discuss openly. All of these explanations have their adherents, and none of them has been definitively proven. What is unambiguous is the result. Human beings with the Navigator gene possess a third eye, nestled in the center of their forehead in a bone socket. They are born with it, and they learn to use it. When fully opened, when the Navigator commits to the complete, unguarded engagement of this eye with the psychic environment around them, they can see the warp, not sense it, the way a psyker might sense psychic disturbances, not detect its presence through instrumentation or intuition, actually see it, in the way that you or I see the room around us, with full sensory detail and genuine comprehensible perception. Is except that what they are seeing is the impossible churning psychic landscape of the Imperium in all its reality-defying complexity. The word survival in this context is doing a lot of work. The act of perceiving the warp is, for an ordinary human mind, completely and immediately lethal to sanity. The gap between what the human mind is built to process and what the warp actually is, in its true, unfiltered form, is not a gap that can be bridged by intelligence or courage or willpower, as it is simply too large. Looking at the warp without genetic protection is looking at something that the mind has no framework whatsoever to accommodate, and in the absence of any framework, the mind disintegrates. Not metaphorically, literally. The personality, the sense of self, the coherent individual that was previously thinking and planning and navigating existence, it comes apart. What remains is something that was once a person, and is now a vessel for whatever the warp decides to make of them. Navigators don't disintegrate. Their gene gives them the equivalent of the psychological architecture to handle the perception. Not comfortably, not without cost, not without the mark of the experience being visible on them over time, but coherently. They look at the warp, and they see it, and they come back. They look at it again tomorrow, and they come back again. Over a lifetime of service, the looking changes them, and accumulates in their mutations and their slowly shifting perception of reality. But they remain fundamentally themselves, capable of interpreting what they see and translating it into actionable navigational information. What each navigator sees when the third eye opens is deeply personal, and this is one of the most remarkable details in all of Navigator lore. The warp's true form is incomprehensible even to those genetically equipped to perceive it without dying. So each navigator's mind creates a working metaphor, a personal mythology essentially that maps the warp's actual structure onto imagery the navigator's individual psyche can work with. Some navigators perceive the warp as an ocean, an endless churning sea with currents and tides and sudden deep water vortexes. They sail this sea in their mind, finding the favorable currents and avoiding the whirlpools. Others see it as a storm-racked forest, where the correct path home is a narrow track between ancient trees, and to stray from the path is to be swallowed by the dark. Some see it as a city in a state of constant geological upheaval, the streets rearranging themselves, but the general geography remaining legible to someone who has spent enough time there. The specific imagery matters less than what it represents, a coherent, workable interpretation of the warp's navigational reality. These internal maps are profoundly individual. Two navigators from the same house, trained by the same teachers, with nearly identical genetic heritage, will each perceive the warp in their own way. And as a navigator grows older and more experienced, the protective layer of metaphor becomes thinner, more transparent. The abstraction fades. The reality beneath it shows through more clearly. The most ancient and powerful navigators are seeing something closer to the warp's actual truth, still filtered through their genes' protection, but with less of the comfortable distance that the metaphor provides to younger practitioners. This is part of why old navigators can seem strange, can seem to look through rather than at the people they interact with, can seem to be present in two places at once, because in a very real sense, they are. The training that takes a young navigator from their first controlled glance into the warp to their first solo transit of significant length is extensive and spans years. In-house schools have developed over millennia, refining their methodology through the accumulated record of what works and what does not work when teaching a child to open their eye to the Imperium and survive the experience. The early stages of this training are conducted in conditions of absolute safety. The trainee navigator is in a shielded environment with senior navigators present, making the briefest possible controlled exposures to the warp through carefully managed apertures, but building up a tolerance for the experience, the way one might build up a physical tolerance for altitude or cold. The first extended transits, undertaken under supervision and with backup navigators available to take over if anything goes wrong, are described by the navigators who survive them as some of the most intense experiences of their lives, not necessarily in the dramatic sense, but in the sense of the sheer volume of new information and new sensation that their gene is suddenly processing. The first time the third eye is opened for a real transit rather than a controlled training exercise. The navigator's coming of age, in the cultural terms of the Navis Nobilite, is not a ceremony or a milestone birthday. It is a solo transit, not a long one and not under difficult conditions, but a transit made alone, with backup available but not active, was with the junior navigator genuinely responsible for the ship's course through the warp for the first time. The houses celebrate this milestone with ceremony appropriate to its significance. It is the moment when a young navigator stops being a student and becomes a practitioner. The first time they have held a ship and its crew on the right course, with nothing but their own perception and their own judgment between the voyage and disaster. As many navigators describe this moment as the one at which they first truly understood what their gene was for. The abstract weight of their role, the civilizational dependency, the strategic importance, the grand scale of what the Navis Nobilite exists to accomplish, tends to remain abstract until the moment they are actually doing it. Until the ship is in the warp and the crew is trusting them, specifically them, and no one else is watching the currents but their open eye. That moment lands differently than any classroom explanation of it could. Now, all of this extraordinary, specific, dangerous ability is in service of one function. The third eye is not a weapon, although it can be. A navigator's open gaze can kill an unprotected person through sudden, catastrophic warp exposure. The third eye is not a divination tool, although the experience of looking deeply into the warp does sometimes produce visions of events that have not yet happened. These are peripheral features. The core function, the reason navigators exist, is navigation. When a ship is in the warp, the navigator opens their third eye and they read. They read the currents and determine which ones are moving in the direction of the destination. They read the obstacles, the psychic storms, the gravity well shoals that correspond to massive celestial bodies in real space, the moving presences of entities large and small that crowd the Imperium, and they tell the ship's captain where to steer to avoid them. They read the fixed reference point that makes all of this possible, the Astronomicon, the Emperor's beacon blazing from terror, and they use it to triangulate their position and their destination. And they do all of this continuously for the entire duration of a transit, not periodically, not in shifts that allow them to stop entirely and rest. But the warp changes as they watch it, and every change must be noticed and responded to. This is why long-distance transits are so exhausting for navigators, and why larger vessels typically carry several navigators from the same house so that the duty of watching can be shared, with one resting while another watches. The physiological quirks of the navigator gene do help. Navigators can stave off sleep considerably longer than baseline humans, at postponing the body's need for rest through a mechanism their biology provides. But this ability is not infinite. An extended transit on a ship carrying only one navigator is an enormous sustained demand on a single person, and the longer it goes on, the more the navigator's reserves of attention and resilience are depleted. The Navy's nobilite, the navigator nobility, the organization of great houses that produces and sustains the navigator lineage, understands this intimately. Their entire institutional structure exists around this fact. The houses are not merely organizations for the purposes of political representation or contractual negotiation, though they are both of those things. They are primarily genetic preservation societies, maintaining the navigator gene through carefully managed inheritance programs, training the young and protecting the old, ensuring that the bloodline continues and improves, and that the Imperium never runs short of the people whose continued existence is the fundamental precondition for civilization's survival. The political power that comes from this indispensability is extraordinary. The Navi's nobilite operates under an ancient compact that grants it a degree of autonomous self-governance that virtually no other institution in the Imperium possesses. The houses are not subject to imperial law in the way that other citizens are. They police themselves through mechanisms of house loyalty and the overriding authority of the Patanova, the supreme leader of all the navigator houses. And the Imperium accepts this arrangement because the alternative is worse. You cannot regulate a monopoly on the ability to navigate the warp into compliance through conventional legal mechanisms. You can only try to maintain the relationship carefully, through mutual benefit and strategic oversight. The one organization that can genuinely override navigator autonomy is the Inquisition. The Ordo Malleus keeps a very close eye on all navigator houses, for the obvious reason that beings who spend their lives in intimate psychic communion with the warp are candidates for a level of corruption and influence that the Imperium absolutely cannot afford to ignore. Warp-touched navigators have occurred. Corrupted lineages have had to be purged. Their entire houses have been burned out by inquisitorial action, when the evidence of their corruption became too clear to ignore. But even the Inquisition is careful, because a navigator house that is destroyed through excessive interference is one more navigator house that is no longer providing navigators, and the supply of navigators is not something that refills quickly. One more piece of navigator biology must be established before we move on. Because it will matter greatly when we discuss the consequences of navigator death, the role of the Patanova. The Patanova is the supreme leader of the Navis Nobilite, chosen from the oldest and most powerful navigators, the heirs apparent, when the previous Patanova dies. The political role is significant, but not unique. What makes the Paternova irreplaceable is biological. Something in the Paternova's presence, some function of their extraordinary degree of mutation and power, warp provides an amplifying influence on the warp site of every navigator throughout the galaxy. All navigators benefit from the Paternova's existence in the same way that you might benefit from the existence of a particularly powerful wireless transmitter. They do not necessarily interact with it directly, but it strengthens the signal they receive. When a Paternova dies and the succession has not yet been resolved, this amplification weakens across the board. All navigators experience a reduction in their ability to see the warp, to track the Astronomicon, to guide their ships. The most junior navigators may lose their ability entirely for the duration. Ships are delayed, some are lost. The entire network of Imperial warp travel frays at the edges. The Imperium treats the succession of the Paternova as an event of strategic importance equivalent to a major military campaign, because the consequences of an extended interregnum are, in their own way, just as catastrophic. Hold that image in mind, the galaxy-spanning web of navigator perception, with the Paternova as its anchor point, and remember it when we discuss what the death of even a single navigator means for the ship that Navigator was guiding. Section 3. The Thread of Light, the Astronomicon, and its costs. In the darkness of the warp, in that roiling, impossible ocean of psychic chaos where ordinary distance is meaningless and direction is a negotiation rather than a fixed fact, there is one thing that a navigator can always, in principle, find. One light, one steady, blazing, psychic presence that cuts through the noise and the horror and the ever-shifting geography of the Imperium, and says, there, that direction, that is Terra, and from Terra, all other things can be found. Yet the Astronomicon is a psychic beacon of a scale that is almost impossible to convey in ordinary language. It originates on Terra, on humanity's ancient homeworld, the political and spiritual center of the Imperium, focused through an enormous structure carved into the Himalaysian mountains, a tiered chamber so vast and so dedicated to a single purpose that it is one of the few constructions on that ancient, crowded, monument-dense world that has no secondary function at all. It exists to broadcast, to shine, to reach its light out through the warp across 50,000, 60,000, perhaps 70,000 light-years of galaxy, giving every navigator who can perceive its signal a fixed point of reference in the otherwise formless sea. The power required to maintain this beacon is enormous. The Astronomicon is not powered by any conventional energy source. It is powered by human lives, specifically by the psychic energy of 10,000 specially selected and trained psychers who serve in the chamber of the Astronomicon in rotating shifts of increasing sacrifice, their life force being slowly drained away to feed the beacon's signal. Up to 100 of these psychers die every single day, consumed by the demands of the work they have volunteered for, or been assigned to, depending on which account of the selection process you find most credible. That these are not unwilling victims in most cases. The Adeptus Astronomica, the organization that trains and manages the Astronomicon's choir of psychers, has spent generations building a culture around the profound honor of this service. Those who are chosen to power the Astronomicon go to their deaths believing, and in many cases being entirely right, that their deaths are personally sustaining the infrastructure of civilization for billions of human beings. But here is the part that is important to our discussion. The Astronomicon's signal does not itself do the navigating. It is a fixed reference point, a stellar lighthouse, in the oldest metaphorical sense of that word. Something that tells you where you are relative to the danger, not something that steers you around it. The way a navigator uses the Astronomicon is this. Once in the warp, they can perceive the beacon's psychic light at whatever distance they are from Terra. Yet the strength and angle of that light tells them where Terra is and approximately how far away they are. With that fixed reference point established, they can interpret the structure of the local warp around them, the currents, the obstacles, the routes. and determine a course that will carry the ship from where it is to where it needs to be. This interpretation is the irreplaceable part. The Astronomicon alone, without a navigator to read it, is just light in the darkness. It tells the ship's mechanical sensors nothing that can be translated into navigational instructions. The cogitators aboard an Imperial vessel can detect the Astronomicon in a theoretical sense. Its existence is known, its general location is known, but they cannot navigate by it the way a navigator can, because the act of translating the beacon's signal into navigational guidance requires the specific psychic perception that only the navigator gene provides. And it is like having a lighthouse that only people with a specific kind of vision can actually see. The light is real, and the lighthouse is real, but if you don't have the right eyes, you're still sailing blind. The Astronomicon has limits that are worth understanding clearly, because those limits define the edges of the Imperium in very literal ways. Its signal does not cover the entire galaxy. The Astronomicon reaches approximately 50 to 70,000 light years from Terra. Sources vary on the precise figure, and the honest answer is probably that the range varies based on conditions in both the warp and real space. Since Terra sits toward the galactic west, the eastern edges of the galaxy, the eastern fringe, in Imperial cartographic terminology, lie largely beyond the beacon's reach. This is why those regions are so dangerous to explore, why the Tau Empire was able to develop in relative isolation for so long, why the Tyranid hive fleets attacking through the eastern fringe created such disproportionate navigational terror for the Imperial forces trying to respond to them. A navigator trying to guide a ship in a region where the Astronomicon is too faint to perceive reliably is flying by intuition and experience and old charts, without the fundamental reference point they were trained to rely on, the Macarian Crusade. The extraordinary campaign of conquest launched by Lord Solar Macarius in the 41st Millennium came to its most serious strategic obstacle, not from any military enemy, but from this geographic reality. As Macarius pushed his forces further into unexplored space, further from Terra, his navigators began reporting an alarming phenomenon. The Astronomicon was growing too faint to reliably detect. They were entering regions of the galaxy where their primary navigational reference simply wasn't visible. The crusade came within a political hair of stalling entirely, not because of enemy resistance, but because the ships could no longer reliably navigate between systems. And then, there is the event that every Imperial citizen who was alive in the latter years of the 41st Millennium has reason to remember. The formation of the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, in the aftermath of Abaddon, the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade. The cataclysm of that event tore a scar across the galaxy's face so deep that reality itself was compromised across enormous regions of space. And in that moment, for 33 days on Terra, the Astronomicon went dark. 33 days. In the history of the Imperium, this is an eye blink. From the perspective of the ships that were in the warp when the darkness fell, well, it was eternity. In those 33 days, ships that had been on routine transits lost their reference point entirely. They were in the warp, which was dark, without a beacon, navigating by instruments that can only provide limited guidance in the best circumstances and nothing useful in the worst. Some made it out, many did not. And the period afterward, the broader darkening that has persisted in some regions where the Great Rift's influence has blocked the Astronomicon's signal permanently, is an ongoing navigational crisis that the Imperium has no clean answer to. This is the context within which the navigator's function must be understood. The Astronomicon is the foundation, but it is the navigator who actually builds on that foundation. And when the navigator is gone, the foundation, however steady, it cannot by itself save the ship. There is something worth dwelling on here before we move forward. Something that often gets skipped past in favor of the more dramatic lore that surrounds it. The human cost of the Astronomicon's maintenance is not incidental to this story, it is central to it. Those 10,000 psychers, dying at the rate of up to 100 per day, are not an abstraction. They are people. They were recruited or conscripted. Depending on your interpretation of the mechanisms involved, from the black ships that collect unsanctioned psychers from across the Imperium's worlds, evaluated for the specific qualities that make them suitable for the Astronomicon's choir, rather than for other uses, and then brought to Terra to train for what will be their final service. The Adeptus Astronomica does its best to make this service meaningful. The culture they have built around the choir's role is genuinely one of profound devotion, and by many accounts, the psychers who power the Astronomicon go to their work with real conviction. They know what they are doing. They understand the stakes. In a civilization where almost every individual's connection to the Imperium's survival is abstract and distant, the Astronomicon's choir has a connection that is immediate and literal. If they stop, navigators go blind, ships go dark. As the Imperium's circulatory system fails, they are, in a direct causal chain, the thing that keeps civilization alive. The weight of that knowledge shapes them in ways that people on the outside of the choir find difficult to fully comprehend. But they still die. 100 per day, consumed by the scale of what they are being asked to sustain. The Astronomicon requires a constant supply of new choir members to replace the ones it uses up, which is one of the reasons the Black Ship's harvesting of psychers from the Imperium's worlds is such a regular and systematic activity. It is also one of the reasons that any major disruption to the Black Ship's routes, anything that reduces the flow of new psychers to Terra, creates a cascading concern that reaches all the way from the individual souls lost at sea in the warp to the Emperor himself, who maintains the Astronomicon's signal through his sustained consciousness from the Golden Throne. The Golden Throne. We cannot pass through this section without acknowledging it, even briefly. The Emperor of Mankind has been interred in the Golden Throne, alive, but unable to leave, for 10,000 years, since his internment following the catastrophic finale of the Horus Heresy, when Warmaster Horus came within a moment of ending both the Emperor's life and the Imperium's future. The throne sustains the Emperor's consciousness through mechanisms that even the Adeptus Mechanicus does not fully understand. And that consciousness, vast, ancient, perhaps the single most powerful psychic presence that has ever existed within humanity, is what focuses and amplifies the Astronomicon's signal and broadcasts it across the galaxy. The Emperor is the light, the choir is the fuel, and the navigators are the only ones who can read it. This is why, as in the broadest view of the Imperium's survival, the Emperor's continued existence and the Navigator gene's continued functioning are the two pillars that everything else rests on. Remove either one, and the whole structure begins a collapse that has no obvious flaw. Remove both, and what remains of humanity in the 41st millennium is not an empire. It is a scattered collection of isolated worlds, each one fighting its own battle against the darkness, and none of them able to call on the others for help, each one eventually facing a threat larger than it can meet alone. The navigator who dies mid-transit is not responsible for this grand-scale consequence, of course. They were one person doing one job on one ship. But they are a node in this network, and the network's vulnerability is real. And understanding that vulnerability is part of understanding why their death matters beyond the purely local tragedy of the ship they were guiding. Section 4. How a warp jump actually works. Inside the transit, to feel the full weight of what the navigator's death means, you need to understand what a warp transit looks like from the inside. Not just the abstract mechanics, but the texture of it. Who is doing what is being maintained, what it feels like to be aboard a ship moving through the Imperium under a skilled navigator's guidance. A transit begins before the ship enters the warp at all, while a navigator who knows their craft will spend time preparing, looking at the warp through the ship's sensors while still in real space, opening their third eye in careful, controlled glances to read the condition of the local warp before committing the ship to it. They perform whatever rituals their house tradition prescribes, which vary enormously from house to house. Some houses use systems of divination that look purely superstitious to outsiders, the reading of runic bones, and the examination of animal entrails, the interpretation of specific patterns in incense smoke.
I want to stop here for a second and tell you what I actually think about all of this, because the Navigator is honestly one of my favorite pieces of 40k lore, and I don't think they get nearly enough attention. Most people, when they think about the big pillars of the Imperium, they go straight to the Space Marines, the Emperor, maybe the Inquisition, and I get it. Those are the dramatic ones. Those are the ones with the cool armor and the dramatic speeches. But the Navigator just quietly does the thing that makes all of it possible. Without them, there's no Imperium to defend. There are no crusades to launch, no chapters to deploy, no supply lines feeding any of it. They're the part of the machine that nobody notices until it breaks. When it breaks, everything breaks with it. That combination of complete indispensability and almost total invisibility in the wider lore is what gets me every single time. They're not forgotten because they're unimportant. They're forgotten because they work. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
But in a universe where psychic ability is real and the warp is genuinely sensitive to consciousness, these rituals may contain more functional content than they appear to. A navigator entering a deep meditative trance before a transit and allowing their subconscious psychic impressions to surface, as prophecy may be doing something more useful than it seems. First, the ship must travel at sublight speed to the Mandeville Point before entering the warp. The Mandeville Point is an invisible boundary that exists around every star system, roughly marking the limit of the system's strongest gravitational influence, and it represents the closest safe approach to a star at which a ship can activate its warp drives without the interference of the gravity well, creating catastrophic distortions in the translation. Entry points closer to a star's gravity well have resulted in ships being torn apart by the interaction between the warp transition forces and the gravitational stresses acting on the hull. Warships and merchant vessels alike treat the Mandeville Point as an absolute rule rather than a guideline. Some civilized worlds have navigation beacons positioned at or near their Mandeville points to assist ships in locating the safe entry corridor. Shao fleet engagements sometimes center on controlling these entry points, because any ship trying to make a warp transit must pass through them, and an ambushing force positioned at the Mandeville Point has an enormous tactical advantage over an arriving ship that translates into real space, directly into the waiting guns. Once at the Mandeville Point, the warp drives activate. These are complex, architecturally enormous pieces of technology occupying significant sections of a major warship's hull. And their exact function is only partially understood, even by the Adeptus Mechanicus, which is, in the context of 40,000 technology, unsurprising, but worth noting. They tear a hole in the membrane between real space and the warp. Not a permanent hole, not a controlled aperture in the way a door is a controlled aperture. A violent, temporary rent in reality that the ship slides through before it closes behind it. And then the ship is in the warp. The first thing that changes, subjectively, it is described by survivors and experienced voidfarers in remarkably consistent terms, a sense of wrongness, not something that any sensor can capture, not a smell or a sound or a visual anomaly, simply the deep, species-level certainty that you are no longer in a place that was built for you, that the laws you depend on for existence are present but fragile, and that you are somewhere that has been aware of your arrival since before you arrived. The Geller field must be active the moment the ship enters the warp, and must remain active for the entire duration. This technology, the Geller field device, creates what is best described as a bubble of real space around the ship. Inside the bubble, real space physics apply. Causality is linear. Matter behaves the way matter behaves in the material universe. The crew can breathe, eat, sleep, maintain the machinery, perform all the ordinary functions of shipboard life. Outside the bubble, the raw warp presses in, and the boundary between the bubble and the warp is where the demons are. They are always there. Every experienced voidfarer knows this. The stories are consistent across thousands of years of warp travel records. The sounds that seem to come from outside the hull, that change in register and rhythm in ways that don't correspond to any mechanical process aboard the ship. Yet the shapes that appear in peripheral vision near outer bulkheads and disappear when looked at directly. The way the lights in sections closest to the outer hull sometimes flicker in patterns that repeat too consistently to be random fluctuation. The Geller field keeps them out. The Geller field is holding, and as long as it holds, those sounds and shapes and flickering lights are merely the evidence of a pressure that cannot breach the barrier. The crew is trained to think of this in those terms. Pressure that cannot breach. The psychological work of maintaining a functional crew during warp transit is substantial, and it is done through a combination of routine, religious practice, deliberate distraction, and strict enforcement of the orders that prevent people from doing the things they might otherwise do out of curiosity or desperation. Opening external viewports during warp transit is forbidden, and attempting to communicate outside the ship through any unshielded means is forbidden. Psychers who are not the Navigator or the ship's sanctioned astropath are kept under close supervision during transit, because uncontrolled psyker activity in the warp is an invitation to catastrophe of the worst kind. With the Geller field active and the crew working around these restrictions, the Navigator's actual guidance work begins. The Navigator climbs into their sanctum. Aboard most serious vessels, this is a specialized chamber near the prow of the ship, often at the very tip of the hull, fitted with a reinforced cupola that allows the Navigator to look out into the warp from inside a heavily shielded space. The sanctum is one of the most heavily protected rooms on the ship. It has its own independent power supply, its own backup Geller field emitters, its own internal environmental controls, and access restrictions that mean only the Navigator, their direct assistants, and specifically authorized crew members can enter. The Navigator sits in their chair, often strapped in during particularly rough transits, and opens their third eye. From this moment on, the Navigator is the ship's eyes. Their guidance comes to the bridge through the Vox, a continuous stream of course corrections, warnings, assessments. Turn to bearing such and such. Reduce speed through the next sector, there are turbulent currents ahead. So there is something large and aware moving 2 points off starboard that we want to avoid. The Astronomicon is strong from this position. We are making good progress toward the correct exit vector. This continues for the entire transit, not once per day, not at intervals, continuously. The captain and the helmsman execute these instructions. The Navigator trusts the crew to do what they're told. The crew trusts the Navigator to tell them the right things. This mutual trust. And across the bridge and the sanctum and the Vox connection between them is what a warp transit actually consists of. It is a continuous collaboration between a human being with a specific gift and a crew with the skills to respond to it. When a transit goes well, and the majority of transits do go well, because the Imperium has been refining this process for 10,000 years, and the Navigators are trained to the highest standards of their ancient craft, the ship slides through the warp on whatever schedule the Navigator projected, encounters whatever obstacles the Navigator anticipated, and eventually reaches the correct exit vector. The warp drives activate again. The hole in reality opens. The ship slides through. Reality closes around it. And the crew emerges into real space at or near their intended destination, disoriented for a moment by the transition, before the chronometers restart their reliable linear tick, and the sensors begin their reassuring survey of recognizable stars. Experienced voidfarers describe the return to real space as having a particular quality that is hard to convey to those who haven't experienced it. A sense of the universe becoming more solidly itself, of the ground becoming more definitely floor, much of the surrounding environment asserting its indifference to you in a way that feels paradoxically deeply comforting after the charged attentiveness of the warp. The warp was always aware of you. Real space simply contains you. The Navigator withdraws from the sanctum, usually showing the marks of the transit in their bearing, tired in ways that don't quite map onto ordinary physical fatigue, sometimes disoriented for hours after the eye closes, and sometimes dealing with minor mutations that manifested during an unusually turbulent transit. They eat, they sleep eventually. They report to the captain on any unusual observations from the transit, and then they rest until the next one. What happens during a long transit, when the ship must remain in the warp for weeks rather than days, deserves more attention than it usually gets. The popular imagination of warp travel tends to focus on the dramatic moments, entry and exit, the occasional crisis, the climactic arrival. But the majority of a warp transit, particularly on longer journeys, is sustained, grinding endurance. Days pass. The Geller field hums. The sounds from outside the hull continue their irregular rhythms. The navigator remains in the sanctum, sometimes sleeping in the chair when they can, waking themselves to check conditions, making subtle adjustments that the helmsman executes without fully understanding what they're correcting for. The crew cycles through their watches. Meals are eaten at the prescribed times. Maintenance is performed. The ministorum priests lead their rituals, morning and evening, and whenever the mood aboard seems to require it. The commissar walks the decks, maintaining the discipline that keeps anxious men and women focused on function rather than fear. The ship's captain holds daily briefings, maintaining the fiction or the reality. Depending on whether you are cynical about the psychology of command, that everything is proceeding normally and on schedule, but everyone knows where they are. No amount of routine can make them forget that they are in the warp, that outside these walls is something that wants them in ways they do not want to be wanted. The routine does not eliminate the awareness, it channels it. Yet it gives the awareness somewhere to go that does not end in screaming or violence or the kind of spiritual collapse that the warp is always patiently waiting for. Navigators have described the experience of guiding a ship through a long, calm transit as something approaching a form of meditation, an extended engagement with the warp's structure that, when conditions are favorable, can produce something that might be called serenity in its most austere form. Not pleasure, not comfort, but a profound, focused engagement with the immediate task that makes everything else recede. The ocean of souls, in a calm transit, can have a quality of terrible beauty. The warp's currents, when they are moving in useful directions, carry the ship with a grace that has no parallel in real space travel. The Astronomican's light, steady and warm from a relatively close approach to Terra, provides an almost constant reassurance of position and direction, as these descriptions come from navigators who survived their service, who came out the other side of their careers, still capable of describing their experience with language rather than screaming. They are, in this sense, the lucky ones. They are also, perhaps, the evidence that the navigator's relationship to the warp is not purely one of endurance and suffering, that something in the engagement, in those quiet hours of attention and perception, it gave them something that made the cost of the work bearable, not small, not trivial, but bearable. Now, you have felt the rhythm of this. You understand the collaboration. You understand the dependence. What happens when the navigator never comes back from the sanctum? Section 5. When the navigator dies, the immediate moment. It is described in the lore as rare. Multiple sources note that navigator death during active warp transit is uncommon. Navigators are genetically designed to withstand the rigors of the Imperium. The sanctum is specifically built to protect them, and the crew of any serious vessel understands their navigator's importance and acts accordingly. Considerable resources are dedicated to ensuring that the person in the sanctum survives their time there, but rare is not impossible, and the warp has creative methods. A navigator can be killed by a warp entity that has managed to breach the Geller field and reach the sanctum before being destroyed or driven back. They can be overwhelmed by psychic pressure during a transit through an area of extreme warp turbulence. A storm, a region close to a chaos-influenced area, a zone disrupted by recent cataclysmic events in real space. They can be driven to irreversible madness by an encounter with something in the warp so large, it's so alien to their framework of perception that even the gene's protection is insufficient to maintain coherence. This kind of madness, the lore is careful to note, is different from ordinary mental breakdown. It is not shock or post-traumatic response that might eventually be worked through. It is the complete structural dismantling of the self from which no recovery is possible. A navigator gone mad in this way is lost in a more complete sense than death. It's because the person who existed before is simply no longer there, and what remains is dangerous to everyone around it. There are also more mundane causes. Violence. Someone might attack the navigator, whether out of madness induced by warp exposure, or chaos corruption, or simple desperation. Illness, which progresses in strange ways in the warp's environment. Structural failure of the sanctum, if the ship takes damage. A sudden, a violent fluctuation in the warp currents that is strong enough to cause physical injury through sheer psychic force. And there is something else worth naming, because the law acknowledges it, and we should too. Sometimes navigators choose to stop. This is not common. The social and biological pressures against it are enormous. Yea, and the Navis Nobelites' internal culture treats navigator suicide during a transit, regardless of circumstances, as one of the most profound betrayals one of their own can commit. But the law does not pretend that a being who has spent decades or centuries opening their mind to the warp's true nature, who has seen things in the Imperium that no one else aboard the ship can even imagine, who is perhaps bearing the accumulated weight of knowledge and mutation and growing distance from the humanity they started with. The law does not pretend that such a being never reaches a point where continuing is too costly. It happens. The Navis Nobilite keeps its records of such incidents sealed, for reasons that go beyond simple institutional embarrassment. Whatever the cause, at the moment the navigator's consciousness extinguishes, while they are actively engaged with the third eye in transit, everything changes. From the crew's perspective, the first sign is silence from the sanctum. The Vox connection from the sanctum to the bridge has been providing a continuous stream of information throughout the transit. Not necessarily a high volume of communication at every moment. Long stretches of a calm transit might see only occasional adjustments, but background confirmations that the course is holding. But there is always something. Navigators do not go completely silent during a transit. The act of guiding the ship requires ongoing communication with the helmsman, and an experienced captain develops an intuition for the rhythm of this communication, an awareness of how frequently adjustments typically come during a particular navigator's style of guidance. When the sanctum goes completely silent, the captain notices. They try the Vox. No response. They try again. Still nothing. By this point, a good captain has already sent someone physically to the sanctum at a run, because the specific silence of no response from the sanctum during a warp transit is one of the most alarming signals any voidfarer can experience, and trained professionals act on it immediately. The person dispatched to check arrives at the sanctum. They use whatever access authorization they have. The door opens, and they find their navigator. Or whether the navigator is dead or mad or incapacitated by something that doesn't yet have a clear resolution, the immediate practical reality is the same. There is no one at the sanctum's controls. The third eye is closed or open and vacant or simply gone in all functional senses. The ship is in the warp with no pilot. The person who found the navigator has to go back to the bridge and tell the captain what they found. This is one of the most terrible pieces of communication a crew member can be asked to carry. It must be delivered quickly, clearly, without the kind of emotional collapse that the situation might seem to warrant, because every second is important, and every second the captain is waiting for the information is a second in which the ship is drifting further from the last confirmed course. The professionalism required of the messenger in that moment is a small and quiet form of heroism that nobody in the histories of warp travel ever acknowledges. And the captain, hearing the report, must hold themselves together, because the crew is watching, always watching in the specific way that a crew watches their captain when something has gone wrong, looking for the signal that tells them whether to be frightened or functional. And a captain who shows fear in that moment loses the battle for the crew's composure, and the crew's composure in the warp, as we will discuss, is not something that can be easily recovered once it begins to fail. There are a few details of navigator biology that create a brief window of ambiguity in this moment. The navigator gene provides some limited degree of ongoing psychic protection, even when the navigator is unconscious. And the ship does not immediately lose all of whatever subliminal navigational benefit the navigator's presence provided. But this is a grace period measured in minutes at most, not hours, and it does nothing to address the ship's actual trajectory. The course the navigator last set continues to be followed, but the course is no longer being actively updated, adjusted for current changes, monitored for the obstacles that are constantly shifting in the warp's fluid geography. But the law is explicit about what happens when a ship continues on a fixed course in the warp without active guidance. It drifts from that course. Not immediately, not dramatically in the first moments, but with accelerating certainty as the warp's currents do what they always do, change. The longer the ship remains in the warp without correction, the further its actual position diverges from where it would need to be to exit at the intended destination. And the further it diverges from where any chart or calculation can confidently say it is at all. The captain's most urgent decision in this moment is whether to attempt an immediate emergency translation out of the warp or to stabilize the situation and try to continue with alternatives. The emergency translation is the safer choice in almost all cases, because being in real space, anywhere in real space, is better than being in the warp without a navigator. But the emergency translation itself carries risks, and those risks are significant. When a ship forces an early exit from the warp, what Imperial naval doctrine calls an emergency translation, it is not going to the destination it planned. It is going to wherever it happens to be in the warp at the moment the drives activate, which may correspond to any location in real space. The correspondence between warp geography and real space geography is complex and non-linear at the best of times, and managed and predicted by the navigator's specific ability to interpret that correspondence in real time. Without that management, an emergency translation is throwing a dart in the dark and hoping for somewhere habitable on the other end. Ships making uncontrolled emergency translations have emerged in known systems far from their intended destination. They have emerged in deep interstellar voids with nothing for light years in any direction, alive in real space, but stranded as thoroughly as a sailor becalmed on a flat ocean with no wind and no currents. They have emerged at the fringes of warp storms, still dangerously close to the psychic turbulence they were trying to escape. And in the worst cases, they have emerged inside or too near a gravity well, inside the corona of a star, inside the atmosphere of a gas giant, as at a distance from a large planet, so close that the interaction of the translation forces with the gravity well was enough to destroy the ship. The lore describes one specific image that has become emblematic of the worst outcomes of uncontrolled translation: a ship tumbling end over end through real space after a badly executed emergency exit, its hull breached in multiple places, its systems screaming, yet the crew thrown against the bulkheads by forces the inertial dampeners can no longer fully compensate for. Not destroyed instantly in this scenario, just catastrophically compromised, just surviving, barely, in a condition that raises the question of what surviving actually means when you are that damaged, that alone, that far from anyone who might help. There is also the question of what the warp itself does in the moments after the navigator dies. Because the warp is not passive. Section 6, Steering Blind, Options without a navigator. Let's say the ship survives the initial crisis. Let's say the emergency translation executes well enough. The ship exits the warp. It's in real space. The hull is intact. The crew is alive. The navigator is dead or incapacitated, and the ship is somewhere. The question now is, what can they actually do? The best possible scenario involves a secondary navigator. Large warships, rogue trader vessels, Mechanicus explorator ships, and any other vessel that regularly undertakes long-range or dangerous warp transits is ideally crewed with more than one navigator. The primary navigator, usually the most senior and skilled member of the house contingent attached to the ship, guides the ship. Junior navigators rotate through support duties, and crucially, they are available as emergency replacements if something happens to the primary. A junior navigator taking over from a dead primary is not a perfect solution, as they are less experienced, less practiced, likely less capable of reading the warp's deep currents with the same confidence and accuracy. A transit that would have been routine under the primary navigator's guidance might be genuinely difficult or risky under a junior's. But they have the gene. They can see the Astronomicon. They can guide the ship, less efficiently, perhaps, with more uncertainty and a slower pace, but they can perform the fundamental function. Or they can get the ship to the nearest port or back toward home. This is why the practice of carrying multiple navigators is universal on any ship that can afford it and takes its warp transit capabilities seriously. It is not a luxury. It is redundancy for the thing you absolutely cannot afford to lose. If there is no secondary navigator aboard, the options narrow dramatically, and we enter the territory of calculated jumps. The calculated jump is a method of warp navigation that predates the discovery of the navigator gene and was the only form of warp transit available to humanity before navigators were bred into existence. It relies entirely on the ship's mechanical systems, the warp drive's own sensors, which can observe the warp's currents from real space before entry, and the ship's cogitators, which process that observation and calculate a course. The ship enters the warp on this pre-calculated course. It runs the drives according to the calculation and exits. The critical limitation of the calculated jump is this: it can only predict what the warp is doing before the ship enters it. The moment the ship is inside the warp, the calculation assumes that the conditions it predicted will hold for the duration. This assumption is sometimes correct. It is, however, incorrect with an increasing probability the longer the jump goes and the more the warp shifts during transit. And the warp shifts constantly. There is a maximum safe range for a calculated jump. Multiple sources in the lore converge on approximately 4 to 5 light-years as the outer limit at which a calculated jump has any realistic chance of delivering the ship to roughly the right location. Beyond 5 light-years, the cumulative uncertainty of not being able to correct for current changes during flight becomes too large. The ship could emerge almost anywhere. 4 to 5 light-years. Think about what this means in practice. The inhabited systems of the Imperium are separated from each other by distances that can range from dozens to thousands of light-years. An Imperial ship under a skilled navigator, making piloted jumps, can cover up to 5,000 light-years in a single hop, 1,000 times the maximum safe calculated jump range. Making a journey of 1,000 light-years by calculated jumps at maximum range per jump, it would require a minimum of 200 individual hops. Each hop requires approaching the Mandeville point of the current system, making the jump, emerging somewhere in the next region of space, determining actual location, proceeding to the local Mandeville point equivalent, and repeating. This process, for a single hop, takes weeks. 200 hops takes years. The lore does not shy away from this reality. There are recorded cases, referenced in Black Library novels and supplementary rules material, of vessels making this kind of grinding hop-by-hop return journey after losing their navigator. The Excoriator's Space Marine chapter's strike cruiser, which lost its navigator to madness during a warp transit and was forced to navigate home by a series of short calculated jumps, becoming months overdue, is perhaps the most prominently cited example. They made it back. But this outcome is the exception that proves the rule. The majority of ships attempting extended journeys by calculated jumps alone do not complete them successfully. The reasons for failure accumulate. Each individual hop carries its own risk of an error that puts the ship somewhere unplanned. Enough hops, and the probability of at least one serious miscalculation approaches certainty. And a single bad hop that deposits the ship in deep void with no nearby system means the crew has to survive on the ship's finite life support resources, while making further hops to find something habitable. And with every hop, the uncertainty compounds. Furthermore, the ship is in real space between hops, spending time traveling at sublight speed between Mandeville points, burning resources, accumulating wear on systems, and giving the crew the psychological and physical toll of an extended journey stretching far beyond what anyone expected. There are also other potential options, though most of them are desperate or carry their own extreme risks. A ship could wait at an inhabited system if the emergency translation happened to drop it near one, and attempt to hire or borrow a navigator from local resources. This is theoretically possible, but in practice extremely difficult. Navigators are rare, or they are under contract to their houses, and a navigator willing to take on an unplanned transit for a stranded vessel is not commonly available. A ship could attempt to contact its navigator's house through astropathic communication and request a rescue vessel with a navigator aboard. But this requires an astropath, and astropathic communication is not instantaneous, and the rescue might take months to organize and execute. In truly desperate situations, Some captains have turned to alternatives that the Imperium officially disavows, but tacitly acknowledges occur. Psychers can serve, in an extremely limited capacity, as partial substitutes for a navigator's guidance in the warp. They cannot do what the navigator gene does. They cannot perceive the warp's structure the way a navigator can. They cannot see the Astronomicon as a navigational reference, but some powerful psychers can sense broad trends in the warp's movement and provide limited guidance that is better than nothing. The risks of using an unsanctioned psycher in this role in the warp are significant, however. The act of a psycher engaging deeply with the warp without the navigator gene's protection is exactly the kind of situation that invites demonic attention, psychic breach, and catastrophic outcomes. Or there is a darker option still, which the records of rogue traders and the sealed archives of the Inquisition occasionally reference in terms that are careful to the point of being opaque. Some ships, in the most desperate circumstances, have made contact with entities within the warp and attempted to negotiate passage. This practice is so thoroughly condemned by every institution in the Imperium: the Inquisition, the Ecclesiarchy, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Navis Nobilitae, as the Navy, that merely considering it officially constitutes heresy. The condemnation is comprehensive precisely because the practice is tempting in a situation of total desperation, and because it has been tried, and because the outcomes have been documented, and because those documented outcomes range from catastrophic to world-ending in ways that explain the comprehensiveness of the prohibition. The warp does not offer passage without demanding payment. Whatever it gives, it takes back with interest, and the interest compounds in ways that mortal mathematics is not adequate to calculate. A ship that bargains its way out of a crisis in the warp arrives somewhere, but what it has agreed to, in the making of that bargain, does not end with the arrival. There is also the matter of timing. How long does the crew have before the situation becomes unrecoverable? This question has no clean answer because too many variables are in play. The quality of the ship's construction, the size and output of its Geller field generators, the psychological resilience of the crew, the density and hostility of the warp currents in the immediate area, the random attention of whatever entities are nearby. All of these factors influence the timeline between navigator death and the point at which no human action can alter the outcome. What the law suggests, but from the accumulated weight of recorded incidents and the doctrinal guidance that the Imperial Navy bases on them, is that a well-maintained ship with an experienced crew has a window of somewhere between hours and days in which effective action can change the outcome. This window is not comfortable. The conditions during this window are genuinely terrible, and the decisions being made during it are the hardest decisions any captain is ever called on to make. But the window exists. The people inside it are not yet consigned to a fixed fate. What happens in that window? Who takes charge? What decisions are made? How the crew holds itself together? How the warp responds to the increasingly desperate activity within the ship determines everything. And the thing about that window is that it closes in both directions simultaneously. As the ship drifts further from any viable exit vector, the navigational solution gets harder. As the crew's psychological state erodes under the warp's amplifying influence, the human capacity to execute even the navigational options that remain gets more limited. These two pressures feed each other, and the window contracts faster than a simple mechanical analysis would suggest. This is why the very first moments after the navigator's death are so critical. Before the crew has fully absorbed what has happened, before the warp has fully registered the change in the ship's status, before the navigator's last set course has had time to drift significantly. In those first moments, the options are at their maximum and the obstacles to executing them are at their minimum. A captain who acts in those first moments, who commits immediately to emergency translation and executes it before the situation has time to compound, has a meaningfully better chance of getting their crew home than a captain who waits to fully assess, who tries to explore alternatives, who spends time that does not exist considering options that would be more comfortable than the only real option available. Imperial naval training has a phrase for this: used in the tactical doctrines that cover Navigator loss scenarios. Decisive imprecision. The idea that in a crisis of this kind, a committed, imprecise decision executed immediately is worth more than a theoretically optimal decision executed too late. The emergency translation to an unknown location, executed within minutes of the navigator's death, is better than the calculated jump to a known location executed an hour later when the warp has already had time to work on the ship and the crew in ways that change the calculus of every subsequent decision. Section 7. The warp's response. What hunts the guideless ship? The clinical mechanical description of a navigatorless ship in the warp focuses on the navigational problem. And that focus makes sense because the navigational problem is immediately life-threatening. But there is something else happening simultaneously that the purely navigational account tends to underemphasize, and that we need to sit with in the spirit of this channel's approach to lore. The warp notices. This is not a metaphor. This is not anthropomorphizing an abstract environment for narrative effect. Within the framework of 40k's cosmology, this is a literal statement of observable fact. The entities of the Imperium are aware of the ships passing through their domain, and they respond to changes in those ships' circumstances. A ship with an active, skilled navigator is not invisible to the warp's inhabitants. Nothing in the warp is invisible to the warp's inhabitants. But a ship with a navigator has a quality of active and alert attention about it that provides a degree of deterrence that goes beyond what the Geller field alone provides. The navigator's engagement with the warp through the third eye is itself a form of presence in the Imperium, a statement, in effect, of awareness. The things in the dark prefer prey that is not watching for them. An actively navigating ship is, in a sense, watching for them. When the navigator dies, this watchfulness ends. As the Geller field continues to hold, assuming it continues to hold, and will return to that assumption, but the quality of the ship's presence in the warp changes. The active engagement ceases. The ship becomes, in the perception of the warp's inhabitants, more like something drifting than something moving with intent, and drifting things are easier to hunt. The immediate practical effect is an intensification of the pressure against the Geller field. This is recorded consistently across multiple sources. Experienced crews who have survived the loss of a navigator during transit describe a change in the sounds from outside the hull, a change in the quality of the peripheral vision phenomena near the outer bulkheads, a shift in whatever ambient wrongness the warp always generates that suggests something has changed from the warp's perspective about the nature of the target. That this is not merely a psychological response by the crew to the stress of the navigator's death, though that stress is real and we will address it. It is also something the instruments detect, at the margins of what the instruments are designed to measure. The Geller field generators show increased load. The indicators that track field integrity begin to fluctuate in ways they weren't fluctuating before. Also, the rate at which the field requires maintenance attention, something that always requires some maintenance attention during a transit, which is why tech marines and tech priests are kept busy throughout any voyage, increases. This matters because the Geller field is not indestructible. It is technology. It fails, occasionally, even under normal circumstances, and normal circumstances are already hostile. Under the increased pressure of a navigator-less transit, but with the entities outside actively working against it rather than merely passively testing it, the probability of a field fluctuation or partial failure increases. A Geller field failure, even a brief one, a matter of seconds, is one of the most catastrophic events that can occur aboard a warp transiting vessel. The lore describes the consequences in carefully limited terms because the full description would be too disturbing to commit to widely available records. Yes, what we know is this. When the field drops and the warp has access to the ship's interior, even for a moment, things come in. Demons, warp entities, whatever the local Imperium has to offer at that moment. They come in through the gap, and once inside the field boundary, they are inside, regardless of whether the field reestablishes itself. The crew that was inside the boundary is now sharing space with things that were generated from the darkness of mortal emotion and that have no interest in the crew's continued corporeal existence. Historical records of Gellerfield failures during warp transit, gathered by the Inquisition over 10,000 years of investigation into void incidents, but describe outcomes ranging from containable demonic incursions that were eventually purged by the surviving crew to total losses where the ship emerged from the warp, if it emerged at all, carrying nothing alive in any conventional sense. The Eisenstein, during the famous flight from the Battle of Istvan, 3 in the Horus Heresy, experienced a Gellerfield compromise that very nearly destroyed it. Yet the subsequent fight to retake and purify the ship is one of the landmark events of that conflict precisely because it was so close to failing. Now, layer the crew's psychology onto this physical reality, and the situation becomes something that operates on multiple simultaneous registers of horror. The crew of an Imperial warp transit vessel is trained to handle the stresses of transit through a combination of discipline, religious observance, routine, and the knowledge that they are being guided. That last element is not trivial. The psychological stabilizing effect of having a navigator in the sanctum, even if most crew members never interact directly with their navigator, even if the navigator is an abstract and somewhat mysterious presence to the ordinary crewman, is real and measurable in the crew's behavior during transit. They know someone competent is watching. They know there is a plan and a direction and someone who can see where the ship is going. When the navigator dies, this certainty is removed, and the removal of certainty in the warp is not like the removal of certainty in ordinary life, where anxiety and uncertainty are uncomfortable but manageable. The warp amplifies emotional states. It is built from emotional states, and it feeds them back to the consciousness generating them in intensified form. Fear in the warp becomes more fearful, as despair becomes more despairing. The anxiety of a crew that has lost its navigator and knows it is drifting in the immaterium without guidance is the seed of something that the warp will water into something much larger. The way this manifests varies. In the short term, it is tension and sharp voices and arguments over what should be done, over whether the captain is making the right call, over whether the emperor has abandoned them. Religion, which is the dominant emotional and cultural frame for most imperial citizens, becomes either the stabilizing factor it is intended to be or the source of hysterical excess. Depending entirely on the quality of the ship's priest, the ship's commissar if present, and the fundamental psychological resilience of the crew. Ships with strong, experienced chaplains and calm, decisive captains tend to hold together through this initial period, better than ships without those stabilizing figures. But the psychological erosion continues even in the best cases. Extended time in the warp without a navigator, whether waiting for an opportunity to make an emergency translation or already committed to it and struggling, wears on the crew in ways that become progressively harder to manage. The nightmares intensify, the paranoia grows, the religious fervor of the frightened sometimes tips from devotion into flagellation, into scapegoating, not into the kind of terrified fanaticism that becomes dangerous when it needs someone to blame for the situation, and the obvious candidates are the other people trapped in the same hull. The Inquisition's sealed records contain accounts of warp transits that went well technically. The ship was not destroyed, the Gellerfield held, the emergency translation eventually succeeded, but that the crew that emerged from them was not, functionally speaking, the same crew that had entered the warp. Yet the specific nature of what had changed in them is classified at levels that make the ordinary reader unable to access the details. What is known is that the ships in question were quarantined on arrival, and that the outcome for the crew varied from psychic treatment and monitored reintegration into Imperial service to something that the records simply describe as having been resolved. Section 8. Time, space, and being lost forever. Even if everything else holds, even if the ship survives, the Gellerfield never wavers. The crew maintains its discipline, and eventually an emergency translation brings the ship out of the warp. There remains one more dimension of the disaster that the navigator's death can produce, and this one operates not in the space of what might happen, but in the space of what always, structurally, happens to time when ships spend unplanned periods in the immaterium. The warp does not have a fixed relationship to real space-time. as this is one of the foundational, consistently stated facts of warp travel in the lore, and it is stated consistently precisely because it is so counterintuitive to beings whose entire experience of existence occurs in a dimension where time is linear and moves in one direction at a reliable rate. In the warp, the correspondence between the duration of time passing inside a transit and the duration of time passing in the surrounding real space is variable, unpredictable, and not meaningfully correctable by anything the Imperium currently knows how to do. Under a skilled navigator's guidance, this temporal variability is minimized, not eliminated. Warp travel always involves some degree of temporal uncertainty, and Imperial military and logistical planning accounts for this through generous scheduling windows and the expectation of variance, but reduced to a range that is generally manageable. A transit that a navigator estimates will take 3 weeks of ship time might arrive between 2 weeks and 6 weeks of real space time later. This kind of variance is acceptable and planned for. When a navigator is lost and the ship spends additional unplanned time in the warp, whether making multiple attempted translations before successfully exiting, or drifting before locating a viable exit vector, or simply taking longer than intended because the calculated jump that replaced the navigator's piloting was less efficient, the temporal uncertainty increases proportionally. Each additional period of unplanned warp exposure adds its own temporal variability on top of the already variable baseline. The extreme cases described in the lore involve ships spending what felt, to their crew, like weeks in the warp before finally managing to exit, and emerging to find that years or decades, or in some rare and terrible cases, centuries, had passed in real space during their absence. The lore gives this phenomenon various names and treats it as a documented category of event: temporal displacement, warp time distortion, chronological drift. Whichever term is used, the experience is the same. The crew boards a ship expecting to arrive somewhere in a matter of weeks. They encounter disaster, they struggle, they survive, they exit the warp. And they are strangers to everything they thought they knew. Imagine the specific texture of this experience. You are a soldier deployed from your homeworld, heading to a war zone to join a campaign that was in its opening stages when you left. You lose your navigator mid-transit. You survive everything the warp throws at you over what felt like 6 terrible weeks of near disaster. You emerge in real space, near a system you recognize. You make contact. And the first thing you discover, before anything else is processed, before anyone can prepare you for it gently, is that the campaign you were deploying to join ended 47 years ago. The Imperium won. The world you were going to fight for has been rebuilt and inhabited by generations who have no living memory of the war. The unit you were attached to was declared lost at sea, so to speak, in the 3rd year of the campaign, and has been a statistic in military history records ever since. Yet the families of the crew received notification of their presumed deaths 45 years ago. This kind of temporal displacement is not a clean, dramatic event in the narrative sense. It is not a swift blow that lands and is done with. It is a slow-motion dismantling of a person's relationship to everything that gave their existence context and meaning. Your home is in the past. The people you loved are in the past, many of them dead, others aged beyond recognition or themselves long gone. Yet the skills and knowledge and experience you carry are outdated by decades. You are a ghost walking through a world that processed your death long ago, and the world has been getting on perfectly well without you. Imperial protocol for temporal displacement incidents involves quarantine and psychological assessment. The crew needs to be evaluated both for direct warp taint and for the psychological damage of the displacement, followed by careful or supervised reintegration that involves extensive support from the Adeptus Ministorum, and in some cases, the Administratum's records offices, as the legal status of people who have been legally dead for decades but are physically present requires careful adjudication. The Administratum, to its credit, has had 10,000 years to develop protocols for this. The answer the Imperium provides to the question of a legally dead person who has returned is not elegant, but it functions. They are assessed, documented, assigned a new identity number, and processed as a returning veteran of unusual circumstances. The bureaucratic machinery of the Imperium is vast enough to absorb this kind of anomaly without systemic disruption. What it cannot absorb, because bureaucracy is not equipped to manage it, is the personal reality of the displacement. No form, however well designed, addresses the fact that the person filling it out has outlived everyone they loved by 40 years without experiencing those 40 years themselves. The theological response of the Adeptus Ministorum to temporal displacement cases is more interesting in a dark way. The official position is that the Emperor's protection extends across all of time and all circumstances, that the crew's survival of the displacement is evidence of his divine attention, and that they were preserved for a purpose, and their later emergence is part of a plan that mortal understanding is not equipped to fully perceive. This framing is not cynical on the part of the individual priests who deliver it. They mean it. They believe it. The sincerity with which the Ministorum delivers this message is actually one of its psychological strengths in these cases. Sincerely held belief, even belief in a theological framework that many would question, provides real comfort to people in real distress. And the Ministorum's priests in temporal displacement cases are among their most skillful practitioners. But there is a minority of returning temporal displacement survivors for whom no framework holds, who processed what happened to them in the warp too clearly, who understand too specifically what the displacement means in terms of the fundamental unreliability of the reality they were taught to trust, to accept a theological solution. These individuals represent one of the quieter ongoing concerns of the Ordo Chronos, who tracks temporal incidents and their survivors with the specific attention that the Inquisition reserves for things that might, if insufficiently managed, become threats. The less optimistic versions, where the temporal drift in the warp has gone so far, or so strange, that the ship emerges before it departed, are treated in the lore with the level of careful restraint that the Imperium reserves for information that is too dangerous to distribute widely. The Ordo Chronos, a branch of the Inquisition that specializes in temporal anomalies arising from warp travel, handles these cases, and what they do with the people and ships they recover from such incidents is among the most restricted information in the entire organization's archives. What is known is that the outcomes are rarely described as positive for the individuals involved. There is also the question of what the ship itself becomes after extended warp drift. A vessel is not merely a physical object. It is a social environment, a collection of institutional memories, a space that has been inhabited and marked by the people who lived in it. In ships in extended warp, drift develop what veteran voidfarers describe as character, not in the metaphorical sense that people casually apply to objects they care about, but in a more literal sense that 40k's cosmology takes seriously. The warp responds to the concentration of psychic energy and emotional life within the ship. A crew that has been living in fear and desperation for months inside a hull, pouring their anxiety and grief and desperate prayer into a confined space, leaves a mark on that space. The ship absorbs it. The warp amplifies it. And eventually, the ship itself begins to feel different from the inside. Experienced survivors of extended drift incidents note this consistently enough that the Adeptus Mechanicus keeps records of it, filed in the category of emergent spiritual phenomena that resist clean technological explanation, but are too consistently reported to dismiss. Corridors that were perfectly ordinary at the start of the transit feel different 6 weeks in. Rooms that have been the site of deaths or significant emotional crises carry a quality that those who enter them perceive immediately without being told about what happened there. The boundary between the material space of the ship and the psychic pressure pressing against it from outside becomes, over time, permeable in ways that no sensor can detect, but that every person aboard can feel. And this is part of why the Mechanicus's salvage teams approach recovered drift ships with the same spiritual protocols they apply to recovered warp artifacts. The ship has been in the warp. The warp has been in the ship. The distinction between the two has been negotiated, and the terms of that negotiation are written into the ship's walls and floors, and the air between them. But for the ship that never emerges at all, for the vessel that drifts in the warp long enough that the Geller field eventually fails, or that the crew destroys itself through internal conflict, or that simply becomes so entangled in the warp's currents that no translation ever successfully executes, there is no temporal displacement to speak of, because there is no return. There is simply the warp, and the darkness, and the growing silence where a ship used to be. Section 9. Space Hulks, the Graveyards of the Lost. There is a phrase that carries enormous weight in the culture of Imperial void warfare, in the bars and mess halls and forward staging areas of every naval station across the Imperium's million worlds. It is not a phrase spoken carelessly, because sailors are superstitious even in the 41st millennium, and the superstition around this phrase is well-founded and extensively documented. Space Hulk. And a space hulk is what happens to ships that get lost in the warp and don't come back. Not all the way back, not cleanly. These are the remains of vessels that spent extended periods in the Imperium without guidance, drifting in currents they could not control, with crews that dwindled through attrition and violence and warp exposure madness and the simple biological necessity of death, until whatever was left aboard was no longer functionally a ship's complement in any meaningful sense. Or the formation of a space hulk is a process that takes time. The warp, as an environment, is not neutral to the objects within it. Materials that exist inside the Imperium for extended periods begin to take on properties that real space physics cannot entirely explain. Metal warps and twists without obvious mechanical cause. The boundary between different structures begins to blur, walls fusing to walls, decks interpenetrating in ways that should be impossible. But the crystalline certainty of manufactured objects softens under the warp's influence, and they begin to merge with each other, with debris they encounter, with anything else that has been drifting in the same region of the Imperium for long enough. A single ship that drifts into a region of the warp where several other lost vessels are already slowly tumbling through the psychic currents will, over years and decades, begin to physically fuse with them. Their hulls touch. The warp-softened metal where they make contact begins to merge. What were 3 or 5 or 20 separate ships becomes one enormous amalgamated structure, honeycombed with the fused interiors of vessels from different eras and different purposes. A labyrinthine mass of corridors that don't connect the way corridors should, of chambers that belong architecturally to ships that were built centuries apart, and that are now occupying the same physical space. The oldest space hulks are almost incomprehensibly large. The process has been running for tens of thousands of years, accumulating the debris of the age of strife and earlier catastrophes. And the largest documented examples have dimensions measured in thousands of kilometers. Some are large enough to possess their own significant gravity. Some have been in continuous existence, in the warp, drifting in and out of real space at irregular intervals, since before the current Imperium existed. And when a space hulk emerges into real space, which they do, periodically, on schedules that do not correspond to any predictable calendar, they are a source of both dread and desperate interest to the Imperium. The dread comes from what is usually living inside them. The space hulk's interior, over the course of its long drift through the warp, has been accessible to anything in the Imperium that could find its way inside. Demons, warp creatures, and the various biological threats that travel through the warp take up residence in hulks, living in the sections that provide something approximating a viable environment. The most famous and feared of these inhabitants are the genestealers, those vanguard organisms that the tyrannid hive mind seeds into the galaxy centuries before the main fleet's arrival, are creatures of extraordinary predatory capability and patient intelligence that can survive in stasis for centuries and that multiply into enormous infestations given even a small initial colonization event. A hulk that has been in the warp for 1,000 years, with even a handful of genestealers aboard when it arrived, might carry many thousands or hundreds of thousands of them when it emerges. But genestealers are only the most reliably encountered threat. Our space hulks have been found carrying feral human populations, descendants of the original lost crew, surviving by methods that have more in common with the practices of pre-industrial civilizations than with the sophisticated void culture their ancestors had belonged to. These communities, isolated from all outside contact and exposed to the accumulated warp taint of their environment for generations, are rarely healthy in either physical or psychological terms. The mutations they carry shape the religious practices they have developed in response to the horrors of their environment, the cultural memory they preserve of whatever it was their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents experienced when the Navigator died and the ship was lost. All of these are subjects of enormous interest to Imperial scholars and enormous concern to Imperial authorities. The interest in space hulks, despite their dangers, comes from what they potentially contain: technology. The oldest hulks are largely made of ships from the dark age of technology or the age of strife, periods when human technological capability was significantly greater than it currently is in the 41st millennium. STC fragments, manufacturing templates, rare materials, data cores that might contain information long since lost to the Imperium. All of these might be preserved in the hulk's oldest sections, waiting to be recovered by whoever can survive the environment long enough to reach them. The Adeptus Mechanicus would pay prices that no other institution in the Imperium could afford to match for reliable access to the technological contents of a well-preserved older Space Hulk section. This is why Space Marine Terminators exist, in the most practical lore sense. Whilst the interior environment of a Space Hulk is one of the few environments in the galaxy where the standard operational protocols of a Space Marine squad, operating in open terrain with clear lines of fire and the ability to maneuver, simply do not apply. The corridors of a Space Hulk are too narrow, too twisted, too unpredictably sealed or opened by the warp-influenced structural changes that have been occurring for centuries. Weapons with large blast radii or high-energy beams that penetrate multiple surfaces are liabilities in an environment where the walls are load-bearing and your own squad is 2 meters away. What the environment demands instead is a warrior who is essentially his own fortress, heavily armored enough to survive point-blank contact, resilient enough to push through corridors where speed and agility are impossible, strong enough to tear through obstacles that would stop any other being. The Space Marine Terminators who board a Space Hulk are not merely brave. They are specifically constructed, through their genetic enhancement and their tactical dreadnought armor, for exactly this kind of environment. They go in with flamers and stormbolters and crackling power fists, and they clear, section by section, the labyrinths that were once the corridors of ships carrying people who expected to arrive somewhere specific. In every Space Hulk that a Terminator squad boards is the physical monument to a Navigator's death. Every fused bulkhead and warp-twisted corridor was once a ship that had a heading, a destination, a crew, a navigator sitting in a sanctum guiding them toward it. And something went wrong. The thread broke. The ship drifted into the warp's currents, and the currents kept it, and the centuries did what centuries in the warp do to everything they keep. The specific forms that different hulks take, the names they've been given by the Imperium when they appear regularly enough to be tracked, the legends that have grown up around the most notable ones. All of these stories are individual instances of the same underlying narrative. A ship was lost. The warp took it. Time passed in the way that time passes in the warp, which is to say in all directions simultaneously and without reference to the concerns of the people inside. And eventually the Hulk emerged, and the Imperium found it. And the process of dealing with what it had become began. In the deepest sections of the oldest hulks, if the structural integrity held and the biological threats hadn't penetrated quite that far, you can sometimes find the original navigation sanctum, preserved by the same warp influence that distorted everything else, but intact in the specific way that important rooms sometimes are, in structures that have spent millennia under unusual stress. And in that sanctum, according to accounts from several boarding missions recorded in Black Library sources, you sometimes find the navigator's chair. Empty, always. The navigator who last sat in it is long gone, in all senses. But the chair is there, and the equipment around it. And if the boarding squad has time to wonder at it before the next wave of threats comes howling through the twisted corridors, they might think about who sat in it last, and what they saw through the third eye in those final moments before everything went wrong. Section 9.5. What becomes of the navigator's soul? This is a question that the lore approaches carefully, with the kind of measured language that suggests those who write about it are genuinely uncertain about the answer, or certain about the answer, and very deliberately not saying it plainly. When a navigator dies in the warp, at the moment of maximum psychic engagement, with the third eye fully open and the immaterium fully present to their awareness, where does the soul go? For ordinary imperial citizens, the theology on this is settled. The emperor protects the souls of the faithful. The Astronomicon serves not merely as a navigational beacon, but as a conduit that draws the souls of the worthy back toward the golden throne, sheltering them from the predators of the immaterium in the vulnerable moments immediately following physical death. But the ecclesiarchy teaches this with confidence, and the comfort it provides is real, and the question of whether it is literally accurate in its mechanism is one that most imperial citizens never think to ask, and most ministorum priests would not appreciate being asked. For navigators, the question is more complicated. The navigator's soul, at the moment of death in the warp, is not merely near the immaterium, the way an ordinary person's soul is at death. It is in it, engaged with it, is connected to it through the third eye in a way that has been active for the entire transit. The soul is already, in a very literal psychic sense, partially extended into the warp at the moment it ceases to be anchored by the body. What this means for what happens next is something the Navi's Nobilite discusses internally with a specificity and seriousness that they do not share with outsiders. Well, the houses have had 15,000 years to observe what happens when navigators die in various circumstances, including in the warp, and the records they keep of these observations inform their theological beliefs in ways that differ, sometimes significantly, from mainstream ecclesiarchy doctrine. And some house traditions hold that a navigator who dies in the warp is immediately absorbed by the immaterium, and that the specific question of what happens to the consciousness afterward is unanswerable from the material side. The soul is in the warp. The warp is vast. What the warp does with what it absorbs is not something that any human investigator can determine by observing the outside of the process. This view is the most common and the most pragmatic, and it has the advantage of being genuinely consistent with the observable evidence. Other house traditions are more specific and more disturbing. They hold that a navigator who dies with the third eye open, whose soul is released into the warp at the moment of deepest engagement, does not simply disperse into the general psychic environment. They hold that the navigator's soul continues to exist in the warp in some form, shaped by the specific character of the navigator's perception, yet their personal mythology of the immaterium, the working metaphor their mind built to contain the warp's reality. In these traditions, the dead navigator's soul becomes a kind of fixed feature of the local warp, a psychic landmark that other navigators with sufficient sensitivity might perceive if they pass through the same region of the immaterium, might even interact with in limited and carefully managed ways if they know how to look for it. The Navi's Nobilite has practices that exist around this possibility. Certain house traditions involve navigators in active transit being instructed to watch for the psychic signatures of their house's dead in the specific regions of the warp where those navigators were lost. The rationale given is informational. The soul of a navigator who died in a specific region might still carry knowledge of the conditions in that region, and accessing that knowledge could provide navigational guidance. But the emotional and spiritual dimensions of the practice are visible to anyone who reads about it carefully. These are people trying to maintain connection across the most absolute possible barrier, trying to find their lost ones in the place where they were lost, trying to learn something, anything, from the dead that the living can use. Whether any of this actually works, whether the psychic landmarks that sensitive navigators sometimes report perceiving in the warp are what the house traditions say they are, or whether they are something else entirely, or whether they are simply the product of minds that spend too much time engaged with an environment that will generate compelling hallucinations if given the opportunity, is not something that can be determined from the outside. What is certain is that this question, and the question of where the navigator's soul goes, shapes the culture of the Navis Nobilit in ways that go far beyond any purely mechanical concern about operational continuity. Every navigator who enters the warp lives with an awareness of what death there might mean that ordinary voidfarers don't share. The standard fear of dying in the warp, of having one's soul consumed by the entities that crowd the Imperium, is a fear that navigators have in common with every other human being who transits it. But they have additional layers of concern and additional layers of possible meaning that are specific to the nature of what they do there. And the culture they have built around those layers is one of the most internally complex and least externally visible aspects of navigator life. The houses mourn their dead with ceremonies that are not shared with outsiders. The content of these mourning practices, the specific prayers and rituals, what they invoke and what they ask for, is one of the most tightly held forms of house knowledge there is. What is visible from the outside is the duration of house mourning, typically longer, significantly longer, than the mourning customs of comparable noble institutions in the Imperium, and the specific pattern of navigational behavior that follows a major navigator death, where house members in active service are sometimes recalled to secondary duty for periods of reflection that have no clear operational justification. The houses are mourning. They are doing what 15,000 years of experience has taught them to do in response to the loss of one of their own in the most particular and terrible way that navigators can be lost. Whether that mourning accomplishes anything beyond giving grief a place to go, whether the practices involved do what the house traditions say they do, whether the dead can be found in the warp and can offer what the living hope they might offer, nobody outside the houses knows. And the houses are not telling. Section 10. The broader stakes. What one death costs the Imperium. We have followed the disaster from its origin to its furthest consequences, and there is something important to note about the scope of what we've been tracing. Every chain of events we've followed started with a single death, one person in one sanctum on one ship, and what flows from that death is, depending on the specific circumstances, anything from a localized tragedy to a strategic catastrophe. Let's think about the military arithmetic of this, because the Imperium does, in its cold and grinding way. An Imperial fleet deploying for a major campaign is a logistical entity of enormous complexity. Every ship in the fleet has its own navigator, its own transit schedule, its own critical role in the campaign's timing and sequencing. The fleet admiral has planned around the assumption that all ships will arrive within an acceptable variance window of a projected arrival date, because military operations in the 41st millennium depend on coordination, and coordination depends on predictable timing, and timing depends on reliable warp transit. A ship that loses its navigator mid-transit and is forced into emergency translation will arrive, if it arrives at all, at a time and place that cannot be predicted by the fleet's planning. If the ship was carrying critical supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, replacement parts for weapons systems, the campaign feels this absence in its outcomes. A siege that was supposed to have ample resupply falls short, and a planetary assault that was planned around having a specific weapons capability available discovers that the ship carrying those weapons has been declared missing and may or may not eventually reappear somewhere. Soldiers die who would not have died if the supply ship's navigator had survived. If the ship that lost its navigator was not a supply vessel but a command vessel, carrying a fleet admiral or a planetary governor or a delegation of strategically vital people, the consequences amplify accordingly. The history of the Imperium is punctuated by strategic disasters that trace back to key personnel being in transit when their navigator died, arriving years late to a crisis that was resolved without them in the intervening time, or with results that were significantly worse than they would have been had the right people arrived when they were supposed to. Now, extend this reasoning to the level of the Imperium as a whole. because this is where the navigator's true strategic weight becomes visible. The Imperium of man does not function because of any single spectacular military force or political institution, however significant those forces and institutions might be. Yet it functions, to whatever degree it can be said to function, given the constant level of crisis it operates under, because of the supply chains. The thousand-world networks of production and distribution that keep the hive worlds fed and the forge worlds manufacturing, and the Astra Militarum recruiting, and the Navy patrolling. Every single link in every single one of these supply chains is a ship making a warp transit. And every ship making a warp transit requires a navigator. And the Navis Nobilite understands this, which is why its political position within the Imperium is so extraordinary. They are not merely a guild providing a specialized service. They are the circulatory system of civilization. Without them, not in the sense of without any specific navigator or even any specific house, but in the systemic sense of without the navigator gene continuing to produce functioning navigators in sufficient numbers, the Imperium stops being an empire within a generation. The million worlds lose contact with each other, then lose common purpose, then lose common identity, and the 10,000-year structure that the Emperor spent his life building and his death maintaining dissolves back into the fractured isolation of the Age of Strife. This is why the Paternova's death is a galaxy-scale event. This is why the period between Paternovas, when all navigators' abilities are weakened across the board, is treated as a genuine emergency, as the Imperium does not have the luxury of letting its navigational infrastructure degrade even slightly. The margin for error is already uncomfortably thin at the best of times. Any additional stress on the system, more navigators lost, fewer in training, houses falling to corruption and requiring purging, moves the whole structure closer to the threshold of failure. The Navis Nobilite's political insulation from ordinary imperial law makes more sense when you hold this clearly in mind. Are other institutions in the Imperium, powerful ones, wealthy ones, ones that the Emperor himself established, are subject to oversight, review, investigation, and the kind of institutional pressure that keeps organizations honest or at least functionally aligned with imperial interests. The Navis Nobilite is not. The houses operate under their own laws, discipline their own members through their own mechanisms, and resist external investigation with a combination of legal precedent and the implicit threat of what happens to an institution that investigates the Navis Nobilite too aggressively and then finds itself short of navigators for its important journeys. This is not lost on the Inquisition, which has spent 10,000 years trying to thread the needle between maintaining oversight of a population of warp-touched individuals with enormous strategic importance and maintaining the cooperative relationship that makes that oversight possible. The Ordo Malleus has files on every major navigator house, maintained with the thoroughness that the Inquisition brings to everything it monitors, and some of those files contain information that the houses would expend significant resources to suppress if they knew the full extent of what was in them. But the Ordo Malleus also has files on what happens to Imperial warp transit infrastructure when a major navigator house is removed, and those files function as a powerful argument for caution. Consider too the military dimension. Every Space Marine chapter has a contractual arrangement with one or more navigator houses to provide navigators for their fleet. The logistics of maintaining these arrangements, the contracts, the rotation schedules, the guarantees of safety and return for the navigator personnel assigned to Adeptus Astartes vessels, represent one of the more complex ongoing administrative relationships in the entire Imperium. Space Marines do not take the loss of navigators assigned to their vessels calmly. The houses know this. The houses have been working with Space Marine chapters long enough to have developed the diplomatic reflexes that managing these relationships requires, which is to say, they have a very specific and carefully calibrated awareness of exactly how much leverage they have and how to deploy it without triggering a response that even they cannot moderate. And yet, and this is the quietly devastating irony at the center of the navigator's existence, as the thing that keeps the Imperium dependent on them is also the thing that most threatens the individual navigators who serve it. Every transit a navigator makes, Every time they open the third eye and look into the warp, they take on a little more of the warp's cost. The mutations that mark older navigators as obviously non-baseline human, the bulging chest cavities, the pronounced brow ridges, the eyes that seem to look at things that aren't there, are the accumulation of years of contact. Yet the slow, psychological distancing that older navigators experience, that quality of looking through the people around them rather than at them, is the mark of a mind that has spent too much time engaged with something that human consciousness was never designed to contain. The warp takes what it is owed from everyone who uses it, one way or another. The navigator uses it more than anyone. Yet the warp's tithe from the navigator is not usually a single dramatic death, though that happens, but a slow, continuous, lifelong diminishment of the boundary between themselves and the thing they're looking at. The most experienced navigators have seen things in the warp that cannot be unseen, have processed impressions from the Imperium that have become part of the structure of their perception, whether they want them to be or not. And when a navigator does die in the warp, when the toll becomes final rather than incremental, they die at the place of maximum exposure to the Imperium, in the sanctum that is designed to protect them, but that is also the point of closest psychic contact with the environment that will eventually claim something from everyone it touches. Section 11. The Weight of the Third Eye. Closing reflections. We have traveled a long way together in this video, from the depths of the Imperium to the navigator's sanctum, from the immediate crisis of a death mid-transit to the centuries-long creation of space hulks, from the fate of individual ships to the strategic realities of a civilization built on the thread of one bloodline's gift. Let's find our way back to something smaller, and in its smallness more human, before we close. The navigator is a person with a name and a history, and a specific and unrepeatable way of perceiving the warp that no one else in the galaxy shares precisely. The lore gives us glimpses of this personhood in the details, the different ways different navigators describe their experience of the Imperium, the forests and oceans and shifting cities that different individuals see when the third eye opens. These are not technical specifications. They are windows into the interior life of someone doing something extraordinary and costly, us processing an environment that would destroy any other mind, finding in it something navigable. The oldest navigators, the heirs apparent, who have spent decades or centuries accumulating the mark of the warp in their changing bodies, live at the intersection of two realities simultaneously. Got the world the rest of us inhabit, where causality is linear and matter behaves predictably, and the faces of people around you don't sometimes blur into something else when you're tired, and the world they see through the third eye, where time and space are moods rather than laws, and everything that exists is in some sense made of the fear and hope of everything that has ever lived. This cannot be easy to live with, and the lore, in its best moments, doesn't pretend that it is. What the cost of being a navigator is not just the physical mutations or the gradual estrangement from baseline humanity. It is the fundamental strangeness of what they know, accumulated over a lifetime of looking into something that no one else around them can see. The isolation of having a perception so different from everyone you interact with, that communication about what matters most, what you've seen, what it was like, what it meant, is genuinely, perhaps irrevocably, difficult. They do the work anyway, not because they have no choice. Though the political and social structures of the Navy's nobility make non-participation effectively impossible, and choice in that context means something different than it means in ours. They do the work because it is their purpose, the thing their gene exists to accomplish, the contribution that their specific and costly gift makes to the billion-year project of conscious beings trying to survive the universe's indifference. Yet there is something in the lore's depiction of navigators that suggests, quietly, a genuine pride in this, not the aggressive pride of power or wealth, though they have both, but the quieter pride of people who know what they do and know it matters and have chosen, in whatever sense any of us choose anything, to do it well. There is something else worth sitting with here. The navigator's relationship to the Imperium is not merely contractual, not purely an exchange of services for protection and compensation. It is one of the oldest continuous relationships in human civilization. The navigator gene predates the Imperium. The first navigator lineage humans were threading the warp before the Emperor was known as the Emperor, before the great unification of Terra, before the great crusade set out to reclaim the galaxy for humanity. The Navis Nobilite has watched every age of human expansion and contraction, and has survived the age of strife when most civilized institutions collapsed entirely, has endured the heresy and the long war and the opening of the Great Rift. The depth of institutional memory this represents is staggering. A navigator house that has been operating continuously for 15,000 years has absorbed, in its traditions and its genealogies, and the carefully kept records that its archivists maintain in conditions of extraordinary security, as a history of humanity's relationship with the warp that no other institution can match. The things the oldest navigator families know about the warp's behavior across historical time, about the patterns of warp storms and their correspondence to events in real space, about the changes in the warp's fundamental character that accompanied the Emperor's placement on the Golden Throne. These are not things that any other surviving institution has access to. They are exclusive, irreplaceable, and the houses know their value. This is partly why navigator house politics are so complex and so consistently fascinating to anyone who digs into them. These are not simply powerful, noble families competing for status and contracts in the ordinary way. They are ancient lineages with long memories, competing over the control and interpretation of knowledge that could reshape the Imperium's understanding of its own history and its own relationship to the Immaterium, and if it were ever fully released. The careful management of that knowledge, what is shared with which clients, what is kept internal, what is destroyed when a house falls, is one of the most intricate political games being played in the 41st millennium, and most of it happens in places and in terms that Imperial citizens will never know about. When a navigator dies in the warp, when the thread breaks in the middle of the Sea of Souls, what is lost is not merely a navigational resource. It is that person's specific, unrepeatable, hard-earned understanding of the Immaterium, the particular way they saw it, the working metaphor their mind created to process it, the accumulated wisdom of years of transits that allowed them to read conditions that would baffle a less experienced eye. It is gone with them. Their house may train another navigator. The gene continues. But that specific navigator is not replaced, any more than any person is simply replaced. Us, and from the perspective of the 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 people on the ship they were guiding, from the perspective of the soldier who needed to reach the war zone, the diplomat who needed to reach the negotiating table, the tech priest who needed to reach the forge world, the navigator's death is the event that determines whether they reach their destination at all, whether they come home, whether the supply they were carrying reaches the people who need it, whether the message they were transporting arrives before the decision it was meant to inform was made without it. One person, sitting in one sanctum, holding the third eye open against everything the warp has to offer, keeping the thread taut. This is the navigator. This is what they do. This is what it costs when they can't anymore. The warp is patient. It receives what it takes into its currents, and it holds it, and it keeps it for its own purposes and its own time. But the people who travel through it, even the ones who don't come back, the ships and their crews that become space hulks or temporal displacements, or simply permanent unknowns on the charts, they were alive. They had destinations. They had a navigator who tried to get them there. The navigator's body, when the death in the warp is confirmed, must be handled with care. The Navis Nobility has specific rights for this developed over millennia, and the house whose navigator has been lost will send a representative to retrieve the remains if the ship makes it home. There are prayers to be said, documents to be filed, gene samples to be taken for the house's genealogical records, the personal effects that the navigator carried in the sanctum to be inventoried and returned to the family. All of this is handled with the thoroughness and the gravity that 10,000 years of practice makes natural. While what is not handled, what cannot be handled by protocol or rite, or the careful management of institutional process, is the simple fact of the absence. The ship that made it home carries the memory of what the transit was like after the sanctum went silent. Those memories do not file neatly into any category that existing human ritual knows how to process. They belong to the crew, and the crew carries them, and the crew goes on. That matters. While in the grim and relentless and occasionally beautiful way that things matter in the 41st millennium. It matters that we know about it. If you made it all the way through this journey with me, genuinely, honestly, thank you. This is the kind of lore that lives at the slow, contemplative end of the 40k universe. The part that doesn't fit neatly into battle reports or faction breakdowns, but that gives everything else its weight. The Navigator is not the most dramatic figure in 40k, and not the most powerful, not the most heavily armored, or the most zealously faithful, but without them, nothing else works. The Primarchs who led the Great Crusade needed navigators to get their armies to the fights. The Space Marine chapters that defend the Imperium need navigators to reach the worlds they defend. The ordinary human beings who live and work and die across a million worlds of the Imperium need navigators for the trade routes and supply lines that keep those worlds viable. The Navigator is the thread, and now you know what happens when the thread breaks. If you found this video relaxing, if you found yourself settling into it the way you settle into the best parts of this hobby, the quiet hours with the lore and the models and the sense of a world so vast and strange that you can never fully map it, please consider leaving a like. It genuinely helps the channel, more than the algorithm tends to make visible. It tells me that this is what you're here for. Subscribe to Q on 40,000 if you haven't already. There is always more to explore, more quiet corners of the lore to find, more threads to pull on and see what unravels. The Emperor protects, even sometimes in the dark.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.